The final word was a key turning in a lock. Mr. Gable, patriarch of Providence Harbor, folded the document with a dry crackle of paper that sounded like breaking bones. He did not look at Alara. He looked at the wall behind her, at the portrait of his dead son, her husband, as if she were already a ghost haunting the edges of his vision. "It is done," he said. His voice was the sound of stones grinding together, all warmth and life worn away. "The house, the accounts, the boat, they are the property of the Gable family. You will vacate the premises by sundown." Alara stood still, a statue of quiet defiance in his suffocatingly neat office. The air smelled of expensive tobacco and heartless ink. She said nothing. Her silence was a language he refused to understand. She had already shed all her tears in the long nights after the sea had claimed her husband, leaving her stranded in a family that had only ever seen her as a temporary vessel for a future heir. Now that vessel was empty, and they were casting it out. Mr. Gable slid a small, coarse cloth bag across the polished expanse of his desk. It landed with a dull, dismissive clink. $50, a gesture of charity, for your passage south. He finally met her eyes, and there was no pity in them, only a cold, hard finality. He then pushed a second, yellowed piece of parchment after the coins. "And this, the deed, your husband's sole personal holding, left to him by his grandfather, a man of profound foolishness. It is yours now, by the letter of the law." She knew what it was without reading it. The old lighthouse on the Widow's Needle. A jagged spit of rock 3 miles up the coast, abandoned for 20 years, a place sailors cursed and children feared. It was not a gift. It was an insult. A final twist of the knife to ensure she understood her new place in the world. Nowhere. She took the bag of coins. She took the deed. Her fingers did not tremble. Outside, on the wooden sidewalk of Providence Harbor, the town watched her. They saw the closed door of the Gable Mercantile behind her. They saw her small bundle of belongings. They saw her face, pale but composed. Pity was a current in the air, thick and useless. Whispers followed her like gulls trailing a ship for scraps. Cast out. Nowhere to go. Poor thing. The only creature that met her with uncomplicated loyalty was Anchor, her late husband's dog. He was a great, shaggy beast, a mix of Newfoundland and sea mist, with eyes the color of deep water. He had been waiting by the door, and now he pressed his heavy head against her hand, a warm, living weight in a world that had suddenly turned to ice and air. He was the only piece of her old life they had let her keep, for he was deemed as useless as the lighthouse itself. She walked past the ticket office for the coastal steamer. She walked past the boarding house that offered rooms to respectable ladies. Her $50 would not last a week in either place. She walked instead to the hardware store at the far end of the harbor, a place that smelled of iron and honest labor. The proprietor, a man named Finch, watched her with wary eyes. "Mrs. Gable," he began, then corrected himself. "Ma'am." "I need an axe," she said, her voice clear and steady. "A good one, and a saw. 200 feet of rope, a box of 10-penny nails, and 20 pounds of salt." Finch blinked. This was not the shopping list of a woman buying passage south. This was the list of someone digging in. "That's a heavy order." "I have money," she said, placing the cloth bag on the counter. The coins made a sound like a final, sad little bell. She bought flour, beans, and a sack of oats with what was left. Her fortune was now wood and steel, salt and grain. As she walked out of town, leading a dog and carrying the tools that would be her salvation or her burden, she heard the first whispers of the new name they had for her. It traveled on the wind, a seed of mockery planted in the fertile soil of the town's judgment. The Witch of the Needle. She did not look back. She set her face toward the jagged silhouette of the abandoned lighthouse, a black finger of stone pointing accusingly at the sky. She walked toward the worthless land that was now her only home. The journey was a punishment. The path along the coast was not a path at all, but a suggestion of one, a place where the granite spine of the land fought a constant losing battle with the sea. Ilara's town shoes, made for church pews and parlor floors, were shredded within the first mile. The salt spray was a thief, stealing the warmth from her clothes and the moisture from her skin. The wind was a bully, shoving and screaming, trying to push her back toward the town that had rejected her. Anchor ranged ahead, his dark form a steady presence against the gray sea and sky. He was at home here, in the chaos of wind and water. He would wait for her, his tail a slow metronome of encouragement, then bound forward again. He was her scout, her guard, her entire nation. By the time she reached the causeway that led to the Widow's Needle, the sun was a weak, watery smear in the west. The lighthouse stood before her, not as a beacon of hope, but as a tombstone. The keeper's cottage that had once huddled at its base was gone, obliterated by storms past, its foundations a scatter of broken teeth. The tower itself was a pillar of stained, weeping granite, its iron lantern shattered and blind. It looked like the ruin of a forgotten god. She dropped her supplies. The axe handle bit into her raw palm. For the first time, the cold weight of despair settled fully upon her. The town was right. Mr. Gable was right. This was a place of death. The wind howled through the broken lantern, a sound of pure, elemental grief. Her knees felt weak. The stinging in her eyes was not just the salt spray. For a single, terrifying moment, she believed her story would end here, a footnote in the town's ledger of tragedies. But then Anchor whined, a low, urgent sound. He nudged her hand, then trotted to the massive iron door at the base of the tower. He sniffed at the rusted seam, then looked back at her, expectant. His simple animal faith was a spark in the overwhelming darkness. She took a breath. The air was cold and sharp, but it was air. She was still breathing. She was still here. The door was a wall of rust and refusal. The lock had been seized by decades of salt. She used the head of the axe as a hammer, beating on the handle, the shock of each blow jarring her teeth. The sound was swallowed by the roar of the sea. It was useless. She slumped against the cold iron, her knuckles bleeding. Then she saw it. The lower hinge, its pin almost entirely eaten away. She used the blade of the saw, working it into the corroded gap. Metal screamed against metal. It was slow, agonizing work. A blister on her palm broke, slicking the handle with blood. But the pin began to move. She put her shoulder to the door and pushed, using every ounce of her weight. With a groan of tortured metal that echoed up the tower, the bottom of the door scraped inward, just enough for a person to squeeze through. The air that flowed out was stale and cold, heavy with the smell of damp stone and decay. Inside was a circular room, the base of the tower. The darkness was absolute. Light from the narrow opening illuminated a spiral staircase of cast iron, ascending into blackness. The sound of the wind was muffled now, a distant moan. The silence of the stone was immense. She explored by touch, her hands brushing against the curved, cold walls. They were solid, 3 feet thick at the base. No wind could move this. No storm could break it. As her eyes adjusted, she saw the faint outline of a heavy stone hatch set into the floor. It had a thick iron ring set into it. She pulled. It didn't budge. She wedged the blade of the axe beneath it, and put all her weight on the handle. The stone scraped, and the hatch lifted. A different kind of air rose to meet her. It was cool, but not cold, and it was dry. It smelled of earth, deep and ancient. Lighting one of her precious matches, she peered down. A set of stone steps led into a vast, bell-shaped chamber carved directly from the bedrock. It was the lighthouse's old cistern, designed to hold a year's supply of fresh water, but it was bone dry. More astonishing, on the far side of the cistern was a dark opening, a rough-hewn archway that was not part of any lighthouse design. The match flickered out. She lit another. The archway led into a tunnel. A faint, steady draft blew from it, a current of air that did not come from the world outside. She followed it. The tunnel twisted, then opened into a series of low-ceilinged cellars, also carved from the rock. They were smugglers' dens, a hidden world beneath the official one. And at the end of the last cellar, the tunnel ended in a fissure that opened into a vast sea cave. The cave itself had a wide mouth opening to the ocean, but it was protected by a line of jagged offshore rocks that broke the force of the waves, creating a small, churning, but relatively calm pool within. Ilara stood in the half-light of the sea cave, the sound of the ocean a steady rhythm. The wind could not reach her here. The temperature was stable, a dozen degrees warmer than the exposed headland above. She touched the stone wall of the tower base. It was cold, but it was a cold that felt like it held a deep, sleeping strength. It didn't lose heat, it stored it. This was the secret. The worthless place was not worthless at all. It was a fortress. The tower was the shield, and the cellars below were the heart. Despair did not vanish, but it retreated, replaced by a grim, fierce resolve that burned like a low, steady flame. The work began the next day and did not stop. Ilara's life became a simple, brutal equation of labor and exhaustion. Her first priority was the door. She salvaged thick timbers from the wreckage of the keeper's cottage, hauling them one by one. She built a second door, a heavy, cross-braced barrier of wood, on the inside of the rusted iron one. It was crude, but it was solid. When she dropped the heavy timber bar into its brackets, the sound of the outside world diminished to a whisper. For the first time in days, she felt safe. Next were the windows, the gaping eyes of the tower. She climbed the spiral stairs, each step a protest from her screaming muscles. The glass was long gone. She boarded them over, using the last of the salvaged wood, weaving a tight lattice of rope across the outside to brace them against the wind. The tower was plunged into near-total darkness, but it was a secure darkness. Her hands were her greatest trial. They were soft hands, accustomed to needlepoint and kneading dough, not axes and saws. They blistered, bled, and broke open. Every night she would wash them in salt water, a ritual of pure agony, hoping to toughen the skin. She cried from the pain, silent tears in the dark. But every morning she would curl those same stiff, swollen fingers around the axe handle and begin again. She built her hearth in the center of the tower's ground floor. She used stones from the ruined foundation, chipping and fitting them into a wide, low circle. The chimney was a problem she solved by observation. She noticed that smoke from her small cooking fires was drawn upward, toward a network of cracks in the vaulted ceiling high above. There was a natural draft, a fissure in the stone that vented out near the top of the tower. Her fire would draw perfectly, its smoke an invisible plume lost in the wind. The massive stone walls of the tower drank the heat. The first night she built a proper, roaring fire. The chill finally retreated from the granite. The stone, once a vessel of cold, became a reservoir of warmth, radiating a steady, gentle heat long after the flames had died to embers. Water was life. The great cistern below was her salvation. She spent a week cleaning it, scrubbing the stone walls of grime and sediment, hauling the debris out bucket by bucket. Then she climbed to the iron gallery that circled the top of the lighthouse. The railing was bent and broken, a perch for gulls. From there, she engineered a system to catch the rain. Using scavenged planks and strips of canvas from her pack, she built crude but effective troughs, angling them to channel every drop of rainwater into the pipe that led directly down into the heart of the stone, into her cistern. The next time it rained, she listened to the gurgle of water filling her well, a sound more beautiful than any music. Food was the next challenge. The land around the lighthouse was bare rock, scoured by salt and wind. But the cellars below were another world. She began the back-breaking task of creating a garden in the dark. She found a sheltered cove a half-mile away where soil had collected. Using a canvas sack, she hauled it, 50 pounds at a time, back to the lighthouse and down into the cellars. She filled wooden crates she'd built from driftwood. She mixed the soil with dried seaweed for nutrients. In this manufactured earth, under the dim, steady glow of a single lantern, she planted the potatoes, carrots, and turnips she had carried in her sack. It seemed an act of mad faith, planting seeds in the belly of the earth. Weeks turned into a month, then 2. A routine, dictated by necessity, took hold. Wake, tend the fire, check the snares she set for gulls and seabirds among the rocks. Haul water, descend into the earth to tend her pale, hopeful seedlings. Fish from the relative safety of the sea cave, her lines dropped into the churning pool. Repair what the sea had damaged. Fortify what the wind had weakened. Anchor was her shadow, a silent companion whose warmth at night was a comfort beyond words. But she needed more. She needed a source of food that did not depend on the luck of a snare or a line. She needed livestock. The thought of returning to the vicinity of Providence Harbor filled her with a cold dread, but it was necessary. She saved a small portion of her dried goods, packed a bag, and with anchor at her heel, she walked the 3 miles back, not into the town itself, but to its edge, to the small farm of a man named Silas, who was known to hold no love for Mr. Gable. She offered him the last beautiful thing she owned, a small silver locket with a portrait of her mother inside. Silas looked at the locket, then at her calloused hands and weather-beaten face. He saw not a ghost, but a survivor. "Keep your locket, missus," he said, his voice rough but not unkind. "The Gables have taken enough from you." He gave her 3 laying hens, a young rooster, and 2 pregnant goats. "They're hardy stock. If anything can survive out on that needle, it's these." The journey back was a chaotic ordeal. The chickens squawked in a crate on her back, and the goats balked at every step, their bleating a pitiful sound against the roar of the surf. Anchor, surprisingly, revealed a hidden talent for herding, nipping at the goats' heels, keeping them moving forward. Her return to the lighthouse with a small, noisy flock of animals was a turning point. She built a pen for them in the largest of the smugglers' cellars, using driftwood and rope. It was warm, dry, and safe from the wind. The sound of chickens clucking and goats bleating in the heart of the stone was the sound of life. The first egg she found in the nesting box felt like a jewel in her palm. The first stream of warm milk from a goat was a miracle. She was no longer just surviving. She was building. Her solitary existence was not entirely unnoticed. One afternoon, a boat appeared, a small dory rowed by a man named Brant, a trapper who spent his seasons along the coast. He was the town's foremost expert on rugged self-assurance. He had rowed out on a dare to see the Witch of the Needle and her rock-bound kingdom. He found her splitting driftwood, the axe moving with a practiced, efficient rhythm. He saw the new inner door, the sealed windows, the faint wisp of smoke from the tower's peak. He laughed, a loud, booming sound that the wind snatched away. "You're a stubborn one," "I'll give you that," he shouted over the waves. "But you're a fool. You think these little fixes will matter when the first nor'easter comes screaming down this coast? This rock will be underwater. The sea will take your door, your birds, and you with it. It always does." Elara simply watched him, her hand resting on the axe handle. She didn't offer a defense. She didn't need to. Her shelter was her argument. Her calloused hands were her testimony. Brant shook his head, the smirk never leaving his face. "Gable's ghost, they're calling you. Fitting. This place will be your tomb." He rode away, carrying the story of her folly back to town, where it was passed around the mercantile like a piece of penny candy, a sweet morsel of gossip to confirm their own good sense. The mockery solidified her isolation, but it did not break her. Her world shrank to the stone tower, the dark cellars, and the churning sea cave. Winter closed in, a slow tightening of a gray fist. The days grew short and bruised, the nights long and deep. The wind became a constant living presence, a restless beast pacing the perimeter of her world. It moaned around the tower, shrieked through the broken lantern, and hammered against the sealed windows. Inside, Elara's routine was the anchor of her sanity. She woke in the cool, still air of the tower's upper chamber, the warmth from the hearth below rising through the stone. She would descend the spiral stairs to the ground floor, the heart of her home. First, the fire. She would stoke the embers, add fresh driftwood, and watch the flames climb. The stone walls, cool to the touch at dawn, would slowly begin to drink the heat. Then came the animals. With a lantern in hand, she would unbar the hatch and descend into the earth. The goats would greet her with low bleats, their breath misting in the lantern light. The chickens would stir and cluck. The air in the cellars was always calm, always the same cool temperature. She would milk the goats, her hands moving with practiced ease. She would scatter grain for the chickens, her presence a familiar comfort to them. Her garden was a place of quiet wonder. In the deep, silent dark of the cellar, the rows of pale green shoots looked ghostly in the lantern light. She would water them with care, her fingers testing the soil. The sight of life, tenacious and persistent, growing so far from the sun, was a daily reassurance. It was a reflection of her own existence. The deep winter was a series of small tests. An early storm, less a blizzard and more a tantrum, threw waves high up the rock face, testing the seal on her inner door. Water seeped in, and she spent a day chinking the gaps with oakum and tar she'd salvaged. A pack of sea wolves, gaunt and desperate, were drawn by the scent of the goats. They prowled the rock for 2 nights, their howls a chilling chorus to the wind's song. But they could find no way in. Her fortress held. Each small victory built her confidence, not in her own strength, but in the strength of the systems she had built. She wasn't fighting the winter. She was living within it, in a pocket of warmth and order she had carved out of the chaos. Then came the storm. It was not like the others. The old fishermen in Providence Harbor, men who could read the sea like a book, saw it coming, and felt a dread they had not known in their lifetimes. They called it the Great Storm of '83. It began not with snow, but with a wind that came from the wrong direction, a hard, malevolent gale from the east that drove the sea backward upon itself. The sky turned a bruised, greenish black. The air grew heavy and electric. For Elara, the first sign was the sound. The constant moan of the wind she had grown accustomed to deepened into a visceral, gut-churning roar. It was a sound of immense power, the voice of something ancient and angry. The sea, usually a churning gray, became a frenzy of white, mountainous waves that did not break upon the shore, but consumed it. Inside the lighthouse, she made her final preparations. She brought in a massive stockpile of firewood, stacking it against the curved inner wall. She checked the bar on her door, hammering the wedges tight. She brought the animals into the deepest cellar and made sure their pens were secure. She filled every spare container with fresh water from the cistern. Then she climbed the spiral stairs to one of the sealed windows and pried open a small peephole. The world outside was gone. It had been replaced by a screaming vortex of sea spray and ice. The wind did not blow, it struck. The tower shuddered with each impact, a deep, resonant thrum that vibrated through the stone and into her bones. But the stones held. They had held for 100 years, and they held now. The tower was a ship of stone, and she was its solitary captain, riding out a hurricane on a sea of chaos. Down below, the fire burned steady and bright, the thick walls holding its warmth like a cupped hand. She was not fighting the storm. She was outside its reach. In Providence Harbor, the world was ending. The seawall, the town's pride, was breached in the first hour. A wave of solid green water, freighted with ice and debris, surged down the main street. It smashed boats against the front of the Gable Mercantile, splintering them like kindling. The wind, funneled between the buildings, became a weapon. It peeled the roof from the church as if it were the lid of a tin can. Families fled their collapsing homes, struggling through waist-deep freezing water to reach the meeting hall, the strongest building in town. But even its thick timbers began to groan and crack under the relentless assault. The windows shattered, and the killing wind rushed in. Firewood was soaked and useless. Panic turned to a numb, freezing despair. The community's confidence in their own sensible, well-built world was being torn to shreds before their eyes. Their systems had failed. Their town was dying. Hours blurred into a single, unending roar. Ilara lost track of time, marking it only by adding logs to the fire. The storm's fury was relentless. Then, through the din, she heard something else. A frantic, rhythmic banging. It was impossible. No one could be out in this. She thought it was the storm, a piece of wreckage battering the iron door. But Anchor heard it too. He stood at the door, the fur on his back raised, and let out a deep, booming bark that was not fear, but announcement. The banging came again, weaker this time. Human. With immense effort, fighting the suction of the wind, she lifted the bar and pulled the heavy wooden door inward. A figure, crusted with ice, fell into the room and collapsed on the stone floor. It was Brant, the trapper. His arrogance was gone, replaced by the stark animal terror of a man who has looked directly into the face of death. His words came out in chattering bursts as she dragged him toward the fire and wrapped him in dry blankets. Boat smashed. Thought I was dead. Saw your light. He had been wrong. She had kept a single lantern burning in the highest chamber, a faint, improbable star in the black fury. It had saved his life. The town. Ilara, the town is gone. The sea is taking everything. He coughed, spitting up seawater. The Gables, he gasped. Thomas Gable, his family. They went out to their winter cottage on the cove yesterday. They're cut off. No one can reach them. They're dead for sure. Ilara froze. Thomas was Mr. Gable's younger son, a kinder man than his father, but weak. His wife, his small daughter. The cottage was in a low-lying cove, directly in the path of the storm surge. They had no chance. The family that had cast her out, that had wished her gone, was about to be erased by the same sea that had made them rich. She looked at her fire, at the warmth and safety she had built with her own 2 hands. She looked at her stores of food, her precious water, her safe animals. She owed the Gables nothing. She owed them less than nothing. Her survival was a testament to their cruelty. To venture out into that storm was suicide. It was not her responsibility. But then she pictured the little girl, She had seen her once in town, a bright ribbon in her hair. She looked at Brant's terrified face. She looked at Anchor, who watched her, his deep eyes full of a trust she could not betray. The moral choice was not a choice at all. It was a simple, terrible fact. She could try, or she could live the rest of her life knowing she had done nothing. She gave Brant a mug of hot goat's milk broth, then she began to move. She worked with a calm, focused efficiency. She packed a small wooden sled with wool blankets, a sealed tin of hot coals to provide warmth, her sharpest axe, and a coil of rope. She tied a long guide rope to the iron bolt of her door frame, the other end around her own waist. She wrapped her face in cloth, leaving only her eyes exposed. "You're insane," Brant croaked from beside the fire. "You'll die out there." "Stay here, keep the fire going," she commanded, her voice leaving no room for argument. She opened the door. The storm screamed at her, a physical blow of wind and ice. With Anchor plunging into the maelstrom ahead of her, a dark shape of instinct and courage, she stepped out into the end of the world to save the family of the man who had sent her there to die. The journey was a descent into a frozen hell. The wind was a solid wall she had to tear her way through. Ice shards, sharp as glass, cut her exposed skin. The guide rope was her only link to sanity, a thin thread connecting her to the warm, still heart of the lighthouse. Anchor was her compass. He stayed low to the ground, his powerful body braced against the gale, finding a path by scent and memory where she could see nothing but a swirling white chaos. She found the cottage, or what was left of it. The storm surge had swept through the cove, smashing the small house to splinters. Miraculously, one wall still stood, and huddled in its lee were 3 figures, barely distinguishable from the snowdrifts around them. Thomas Gable, his wife, and their little girl, wrapped in her father's coat. They were alive, but only just. The child was not moving. There were no words. There was only desperate, frantic action. Ilara worked with the strength born of hard labor and harder will. She got Thomas and his wife to their feet. She wrapped the little girl in the warm wool blankets from the sled, placing the tin of hot coals near her small body. She loaded the child onto the sled and began the impossible journey back, the 3 of them tied to each other, following the rope, with Anchor leading them home. Thomas Gable stumbled through the door of the lighthouse and stopped, his mind unable to process what he was seeing. He had been prepared for a cold, dark hovel, a place of bare survival. Instead, he was hit by a wave of impossible warmth. It was not the scorching heat of a stove, but a deep, radiant warmth that seemed to emanate from the very stones. In the center of the room, a large, contained fire burned with a clean, steady light. His gaze followed the curve of the wall, seeing the neat stacks of firewood, the tools hanging in their proper places. He heard a sound he couldn't comprehend, the soft clucking of chickens. It was coming from below. His wife, half carried by Ilara, collapsed onto a bed of furs near the fire, her eyes wide with disbelief. Ilara took the small, limp form of his daughter from the sled. She unwrapped the blankets and began to chafe the child's frozen hands and feet. She did not speak. She simply worked, her movements sure and practiced. Thomas saw her hands, crisscrossed with the white, healed scars of hard labor, and felt a profound, soul-shaking shame. This was the woman his father had discarded like trash. This was the witch of the needle. When the storm finally broke 2 days later, the silence it left behind was as shocking as the noise had been. A search party from the ravaged town, led by a grim-faced Mr. Gable, made their way out to the Needle. They were not expecting to find survivors. They were coming to collect the bodies. Mr. Gable stood at the threshold of the lighthouse, his face a mask of shock. He saw his son, alive. He saw his daughter-in-law, alive. He saw Brant, the trapper, alive. And by the fire, wrapped in a goatskin, sat his granddaughter, pale but breathing, sipping warm milk from a wooden cup held by Ilara. His eyes swept the room, taking in the impossible reality of it. The warmth, the order, the scent of cooking food. He looked at the stone hatch in the floor, from which Ilara had just emerged with a basket of fresh eggs. He looked at the woman he had sent to this forsaken rock to be forgotten. She was not a ghost. She was the only thing that had weathered the storm. He took a step forward. His authority, his wealth, his pride, it had all been smashed to pieces along with his town. All that was left was the raw, humbling truth. He looked at Ilara, and the hard lines of his face seemed to crumble. "We were wrong," he said. The words were quiet, a piece of rubble in the vast silence. I was wrong. You saved them." Ilara looked at him, her expression unreadable. She held out the cup she was holding. It was not for his granddaughter, but another she had poured. "There is food," she said, her voice even. "Eat. You must be cold." There was no triumph in her words. No, "I told you so." There was no room for vengeance in the world she had built. There was only the simple, profound grace of a warm hearth and a full cup. Her victory was not in his defeat, but in her own quiet, unshakable strength. In the weeks that followed, the story spread through the ruins of Providence Harbor. The derisive nickname, Witch of the Needle, died on their lips. They began to call her the Keeper, not just of the light, which she had rekindled with a new, steady flame, but of a wisdom the town had forgotten. People began to make the journey out to the lighthouse, not to mock, but to learn. They came with questions, their own survival now hanging in the balance. How had she survived? How had the stone held? She showed them. She showed them the cistern, the cellars, the way the fire heated the stone. She explained how she had worked with the rock, not against it, using its mass and stability as a shield. She shared her stored food, her knowledge, her goat's milk. She held nothing back. Providence Harbor was rebuilt, but it was not the same town. The new houses were built lower, with deep stone foundations inspired by the lighthouse. The community, humbled by the storm and shamed by their treatment of Ilara, lost some of its brittle pride and gained a measure of hard-won wisdom. Mr. Gable, a broken man, stepped down from his position as town leader, and his son Thomas, forever changed by his rescue, took his place with a new and quiet humility. Years later, Ilara stood on the iron gallery at the top of her tower. The wind was a gentle breeze now, a familiar friend. Beside her, his great head resting on the rail, was Anchor, his muzzle now white with age. Below, the lights of the rebuilt Providence Harbor glittered against the deep blue of the twilight. It was a part of her world, but she was no longer a part of its. She was her own place, a sovereign nation of stone and sea. They had given her a ruin to die in, but she had built a life. They had given her a tombstone, and she had turned it into a foundation. Her legacy was not written in laws or ledgers, but in the quiet strength of the stone walls around her, a testament to the simple, enduring truth that what others discard as worthless can, in the right hands, become the very thing that saves them all.